All right. So again, just to repeat those two quick housekeeping items, today's presentation, Your Ideal Self, and Sarah's bio will be made available to you by email after today's session. And I also wanted just to remind everybody, even though you are muted on the presentation today, we truly look forward and want your messages and comments in the chat box. I know Sarah will be providing opportunities throughout to get some of your feedback as well. And those that we can respond to during the presentation, I know Sarah will do that. Otherwise, we will also address them upon the conclusion of the presentation. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I just want to officially welcome all of you and thank you for joining Corporate College's webinar series, Live with the Experts. We look really forward to you to providing truly relevant information, the tools, and the topics that are really going to support you during these difficult days. We find each day, many businesses are shifting to a new reality of working remotely and learning remotely. And here at Tri-C, we are committed to serving you in this time of rapid change by providing actionable resources to help you and your team succeed and thrive wherever they are, whether they're still located at the work site or remotely. Our webinar series is one of Corporate College's newest resources to prepare the workforce to overcome challenges and achieve personal as well as business goals. And our series focuses on 4 themes. Today's is going to focus on navigating transition, right? Always a difficult topic, handling change. You'll notice other sessions also deal with virtual leadership, working remotely, and even personal health and well-being. And as many of you know, Corporate College has a very distinguished and talented team of facilitators and subject matter experts. Today, I'm pleased to introduce our presenter and facilitation specialist, Sarah Bartlett. Sarah specializes working with both individuals and organizations to make that big and sometimes daunting task of change easier. Thank you, Sarah. She's been in your shoes too and shares that knowledge and experience in our session today. So with that, I'm so very pleased to present to you Sarah. So thank you, Sarah. How are you doing today? Oops, one moment.
And I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
You're more than welcome. Thank you so much.
Excellent. So to take it away again today, as Geraldine mentioned, this is a short session focusing on transition. Titled Your Ideal Self, we'll be working through a couple of different items during this presentation. And also, as Geraldine mentioned, I really want to hear from you. So there is a chat box or a chat feature that you should be able to access. If you move your mouse slightly, you'll see either on the bottom or the top of your screen, it's a small blue circle with kind of looks like a speech box. That's where you'll click and be able to communicate either with me directly or with the rest of the members in our audience today. But again, interaction is key. And if you have a question that comes up during the session, please feel free to ask it. Don't go ahead and wait all the way to the end unless you prefer to do that as well. So in talking about our presentation today, we are going to cover the foundational elements of intentional change theory as it relates to a transition that you're going through. We're going to review some examples of how the model can be applied in a variety of scenarios. There's a lot of different options here, so I'll run through a couple examples, but I want to also be able to make sure that you see one that is appropriate for you as well. And lastly, applying that model to your own scenario and potentially getting feedback from others. So as we go in through this, curious to know from those in the room, why now? Why change? So if anyone wants to throw into the chat box, why are you thinking about changing right now? And I'm guessing that for some of you it's coronavirus related, but for maybe some of you it's not. Some of the individuals that I talk to are thinking of a lot of different reasons for change. Maybe they're at a transition point in their career. Maybe at their organization is having a specific transition. So again, if you have an opportunity, now's the time to share in the chat box, what are some of your reasons for making change right now? Is there something specific? Maybe it is solely coronavirus related or it is another topic, but what is that reason for your change? What is some of the things that you're thinking about? So again, I'll look to the chat box to see if anyone has any feedback there as to why they're looking to change right now. So some of the individuals that I've been talking to related to individual change is they're looking to make a shift in their career because now they're identifying that this isn't really where they want to be going in their career and they're looking to make another step. I have another individual in the group, thanks Tammy Dubin, talking about really attending to learn about the client coaching. So how is this that you can use this tool with those that you work with? And that's appropriate whether or not you're a coach, a manager, a leader in any capacity, whether formal or informal leader. Another individual saying that they're in a new role and they're expecting some cultural shift and want to be able to realign in the moment. So thinking about how this practice can be useful and effective for them. Another individual sharing it's about career development. Absolutely, this is a great tool for that and being able to see another way of framing the conversation. Another individual sharing absolutely using this time as an opportunity for personal and professional growth, making maybe a shift in that mindset from another person here in the chat box. And wanting to make that shift, maybe avoiding that burnout that we're having right now, working remotely, where maybe you can't leave your office. You're constantly in your office because it's in your home. So thinking about how it is that you're structuring your time a little bit differently. Another individual sharing, I believe I can be a better contributor. How is it that I can do that? I want to understand a little bit more of that. Another individual talking about what does it mean to be an ideal parent. I myself recently opened a daycare for toddlers. So in this situation, we are learning all kinds of new and different things, and how can we be intentional about that going forward? So curious to know from this audience, and again, if you can just chat in the box, are you looking to make a change for yourself or for in your organization? Again, this tool can be applied to a multitude of different scenarios. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you yourself are going through a career transition. It could be a tool that you use for a strategic planning exercise, a return to work scenario. So there's a lot of different applications here. So I'm curious, based on what you were reading in the description or the presentation bio, what are some of the things that you've been thinking about? I'm seeing a lot of individuals here in the chat, both privately and publicly, saying looking to make changes in both scenarios and thinking about how it might apply. A few individuals saying this is about a personal change. This is about me being able to do something for myself and thinking about how I apply this going forward. Great. Another individual talking about how do I be a leader, both at home and at work? How can I use this as a tool to help make that happen? So fantastic. That really helps kind of get a sense of what the mix that we have in the room. I figured it was a mix of both, and learning a little bit about how we can use that better. Another individual sharing about project management skills, making a change for themselves and in their personal life. Fantastic. So the intentional change theory is actually local to Cleveland. So this is Richard Boyatzis's model that he came out with in the late 60s. He is a professor at Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University, and talks about intentional change theory as this multi-level theory that predicts sustained desired change for either dyads, teams, organizations, communities, countries. I include individuals in that as well. Because having been in the classroom with Richard, this is a tool that he uses for individual development as well. So even though you don't see individual listed in his direct quote, it is something that you can apply to yourself individually. So the three components that he really was specific and wanted to highlight directly in this is the sustained desired change. So that change can be, for example, a behavior. Maybe it's a habit, maybe it's a dream, an inspiration, something that you'd like to modify in your work that you're doing or in what it is that you want to accomplish. So the change can be a wide number of things. Maybe in an organization, this is a change around a new software, a new way of doing something, a new leadership structure, a new manager. So there may be a lot of different applications on what that change might be. Making it clear that this is a desired change. So the fact that either the individual themselves or that organization, they want it to happen. They want this change to occur. They want it to be occurring to them. And I think that's really important here, especially in the time that we're in. A lot of us have been forced to make change not by our choice, right? You may have recently started doing remote work for your job or for your organization. When I talk to companies about implementing remote work, for example, we talk about a planned change, a structured change, something that was deliberate, that had been thought out for a long period of time before doing that implementation. This type of switch to remote work was sudden, was maybe forced, was maybe implemented very quickly. And sometimes when that happens, there's resistance in that process. Not that there's anything personal, it's just if it isn't something that you're desiring, the outcome may be slightly different or the impact might be different. So thinking about how do I know that this change is desired and how do I know that either myself or the team that I'm supporting want this to occur. And the last important part that he wanted to highlight is sustained. This is about long-term change. And we have change lasting for a long time. And so thinking about that this isn't a quick fix, this isn't a fad change, this is about something where you're intentionally thinking about 1 year out, 2 year out, 3 year out, maybe even further. And so designing some of that from the beginning and thinking about it as it goes through. So again, this is a kind of overview and high level about what is the theory. And we're going to dive into what he calls the 5 discoveries. So this model of change, and this is an adapted graphic, but if you look for the real graphic for Biopsis's model, it has a lot of lines and a lot of arrows. So this is a simplified version of the model of intentional change. And it starts with this red oval that we have at the top, my ideal self. So encouraging either that individual or that leader of an organization to think about, who do I want to be? Who do I want this organization to be? Where do I want us to be at? And starting with that identification and that discovery of what is it that I see in our future and not our ideal future. Next, the conversation moves to my real self. So who am I? What am I currently? Where am I really at? Right? Maybe my ideal self is I want to be #1 in this particular field. I want to be a recognized authority and an expert. And let me do a gut check right now on that real self to say, but where am I really? What does it mean to be in that ideal scenario? What does it mean to have that go forward? So after taking a moment to think about the ideal self and then the real self, the individual or organizational leader thinks about their strengths. So this is where the ideal self and the real self overlap, where you already have a strength, you already have a competency that's going to support your ability to move forward in that area. So really taking the time to think about in that moment, and we'll review through this as we do an example, but thinking about where my strength is going to be supporting me as I move towards this ideal self. Let's say you have a goal that you want to work on. Are you someone who has a lot of internal motivation? Excellent. That may be a strength for you and an opportunity for you to do a little bit more towards your ideal self vision. The next thing for that individual who's working through this exercise to think about is your gaps. And notice that the language here is not your weaknesses. This is your gaps. And this is where your ideal self and your real self differ. Again, it's not deficiency focused, it's not negatively framed. This is about where it's just different, where maybe you're not there yet. The yet being the key word there. So thinking about those gaps, let's say my goal is I want to enroll into a PhD program. All right, well the gap is, one of the gaps is I may not have the time to do that. I may not have the financial ability to do that. I may not have identified the program I want to work in. So thinking about some of those gaps is, where is that different self? What does that look like? What are the components of that? After taking the time to think about, again, starting from ideal self to then where you're actually at, the real self, you've looked at your strengths, you've looked at your gaps, it's then about building that learning agenda. And that learning agenda is your roadmap. It's figuring out how it is that you're going, where you're going to start from, your real self, towards your ideal self. What are those steps that you're going to take? What is the path that you're going to follow? And what are some of the components in that agenda going forward? And again, I think you'll notice from this diagram, there's a looping circle around the exterior. And to that point, it talks about looping back through, right? We're gonna, as we go through the next two items, we're gonna come back through this. So don't think that if on the learning agenda you had initially decided that maybe you needed to do 3 things, on your second go around, you may have identified that maybe you need to add 2 more, or maybe you need to take away 1, or maybe you need to adjust or modify this as you're working through it. So again, this is not a concrete document. Once you write it, it's not set in stone. This is a more fluid process, accommodating for some of that variation. So again, that learning agenda is where you are building on those strengths that you have and reducing the gaps, reducing those barriers or opportunities for you going forward. Next, moving from that, so you've developed the plan, you have the roadmap, it's about experimentation. So experimenting with those new behaviors that you've learned, those new skills that you've acquired, the new path that you want to try, the new program you want to roll out, or that new initiative you want to start in your team. It's about practicing it, right? And getting feedback along the way throughout the process. So we're going to talk a little bit later about how that experimentation shows up, but it's one thing to learn it, it's another thing to do it. And so taking the time to be able to actually apply, and that's part of the experimenting model. The next thing is practicing it, right? So experimenting is setting up, how is it that I'm going to do this? What is the structure going to be? How am I going to do it in a safe place? Practicing is about developing that competency and working for it going forward. If you're someone, let's say, for example, who supervises people, you may be sent to maybe corporate college's supervisory series. As soon as you walk out of that training, are you all of a sudden, the best supervisor? It takes practice, right? You need to take the time to be able to use that new behavior, to build mastery in that area, and decide, how are you going to be applying it. And you'll notice that each of these different areas goes to the center around developing these trusting relationships. Throughout this entire process, support is key. And whether you're an individual looking to make change, support could look different. Perhaps it's a mentor, perhaps it's a coach, perhaps it's a family member, perhaps it's a former colleague that you've worked with who is a support and encourager for you to be able to help you through each of the steps in this process. If you're in a work scenario, that support may be your peers on the project, individuals and other organizations who are going to help you move the project forward. They could even be stakeholders on an initiative, but again, individuals who are going to help you through this process and give you feedback. If you're working on a professional development goal in the context of your work, this could be coming from a supervisor or a mentor, someone giving you that feedback live and support live so that you know how is it that you're going to take this forward. So as I was talking about, this is the structure, this is the model on how it works, and you'll see there's 2 circles. There's the dotted line circle going around, or I guess oval, and then there's the larger thick line, which isn't dotted. This is meant to be an iterative process, meaning we repeat it, and we go through it again. Because as you're practicing that behavior, what looks like the final step, you may identify that perhaps my vision of ideal self has changed through my experience, through what I'm learning, and through what I'm seeing. So it may be a process that you make adjustments as you're going through and you make some changes along the way. So again, definitely not set in stone, but certainly an opportunity for you to think about how it is that you want to apply this going forward. So when we talk about these 5 discoveries, Boyatzis' model, here they are. And again, I've kind of paraphrased them a little bit from an article that he published. But the first of these discoveries, as we've talked about, is this ideal self and a personal vision. So what is it that you're taking forward? What is it that you want to accomplish? For example, I mentioned the goal of going back to school, let's say, as a personal goal. Well, is that really the ideal self? Or is the ideal self or that personal vision, I want to be someone who's recognized as an expert in my field and has developed competency to be speaking nationally. And maybe one of the components of that, or the items that's on my learning agenda, is to attend more seminars, perhaps get a secondary degree, do more other things that would be in support of that. But I encourage you to think about your ideal self or that personal vision pretty broadly. we're going to get to the action steps later, but what is the purpose of what it is that you're trying to do? Let's say you're in an organizational setting and you're looking to change the way in which you do business, either because of coronavirus or not, but you're changing maybe the way that you are doing your business. So what is the ideal self or ideal future for your organization? We want to be an organization that responds to all customer inquiries within 24 hours, or we want to be an organization that allows people the flexibility to work home if they want to, or we want to be an organization that uses electronic document storage to streamline processes, let's say. And talk to me about why it is that you want to do that. We want our staff members to be able to execute on projects regardless of where they are. Okay, you're moving me more towards what is the vision here? What's the purpose? And when you move it away from we want to implement a document management system to we want staff to be able to freely work and access documents wherever they're working, those have different feelings to them and have different implications. So again, there's action steps later on, but thinking about why is it that you're doing this change? Why is it that you're doing this project? The next one here, we talked about the real self. And this real self, thinking about the comparison between what we said in ideal self and thinking about these strengths and weaknesses. So again, framing it as either strengths or gaps, strengths and opportunity. The language choice is up to you. But thinking about what is that personal balance sheet going to look like? What are my assets? What are my liabilities? What are some of those things that I'm going to look at as things that will support me in this process? And maybe things that I need to work on or beef up more or address more. Again, in your personal setting or situation, let's say again, this is a career change. One of my strengths is that I have motivation, I have initiative, I have creativity. But maybe a gap or an opportunity for you is you easily get distracted, or you need a job with certain requirements that might be limiting, or you need to stay within a certain geography. So just really being honest with yourself about what are some of those strengths that you have, or maybe opportunities that you might need to be able to adjust going forward. The third component, as we talked about, this is that learning agenda and the plan. I love planning. I'm a project planner. In my core, and so thinking about, okay, what are the things that I need to learn? What are the steps I'm going to take? What is the process? What are the dates? What are all of the different components about how I am going to move myself from the real self to the ideal self, or again, my organization. These are all where all of your project managers, change managers, operations people come in when you say, here's what we want, here's our gaps, how do we get there? And so this agenda or plan that you're developing is how you're going to be focusing the conversation on how do we move from here. Next, we talked about experimentation and practice with that new behavior. So again, we need to think about how are we going to test our feet with it, whether it's individually with a specific goal that we're working on or organizationally. Let's say you're rolling out a new software in an organization, enterprise-wide. Most organizations, when they do that kind of large rollout, they start with a test department or a smaller department where they can roll out a component of it or do it in a sandbox or test setting. You don't push it out live into the organization, into production the first time that you're doing it, unless there's some emergency in which you need to do that. So thinking about how you're being deliberate about that experimentation, let's say it's on the career side, an individual choice, this might look like shadowing. This might look like informational interviewing. This might look like going to a event or a webinar or a industry talk to learn a little bit more and experiment and get your foot in the water. And practicing that. I mean, that's absolutely key. For those of you who've learned professional skills over time, there's one thing being in the class, and then there's another thing doing it. And then doing it with different people, right? One employee may respond differently to a specific tool or technique that you're trying than another employee who maybe has more experience, less experience, familiar with your industry, not. And so thinking about how you're going to practice and be prepared for a lot of different situations. And lastly, having these trusting and resonant relationships that enable a person to experience and process everything that they're learning. So each discovery as they're going through. So as you're going through and say, wow, I did not realize that this. Who are you sharing that with? Are you sharing it with a colleague, a former colleague, a friend, a mentor, a coach, your project team, a sponsor? And so thinking about who is it that is getting the benefit of your learning as you're going through this, as you're being intentional about the change you want to make. So I just want to pause for a moment and see, are there specific things that are resonating for people? Again, the chat is a great place to include that. Any of these five different discoveries that come out to you as maybe surprising, you hadn't considered including that as in part of your plan. So I'll just pause for a moment and see if anyone has any kind of things that hit them as surprising or that they are looking forward to explore a bit more. Okay, so I'm seeing some individuals that I talked to about this and certainly echoed is they are really good at the planning stage. They just didn't take the time to identify the requirements before. So this is very common I see in organizational settings where individuals jump to what they think is the solution, they think is the problem, and start, project planning or action planning against that. And taking that time before step 3, before you get excited about creating the plan, to really think about what is it we want to accomplish? What is it that we're doing? Where is our vision? What is our clarity? And what do we already have? What are some of the systems? What are some of the tools that we already have to be able to help us and support us with this going forward? So I definitely see a lot of people jump to 3. That's normal and natural, just because it's for the project management-minded people, that's the fun part. But really taking the time to make sure your requirements or what it is or your personal vision has been identified up front makes a huge difference in being effective in the long run. Well, great. So what we're going to do now is we're going to dive into each of these. I've got several set of questions. So this would be a great time if you have a pen and paper, if you prefer to take notes electronically, if you have a tablet or whatever your process is. But we're going to work through each of these discoveries. I've got a couple of questions that you should be asking yourself for each of them. And again, don't feel the need to write all the questions down. You will be getting a copy of this presentation afterwards. But again, working through it, and I'd be curious if anyone would like to share as we're going some of the answers that they're seeing. So I'll point out maybe one question that I'd like individuals to share on as we're going through this. So in our first one here, as we said, this starts with ideal self and a personal vision. So some questions to ask yourself as you're moving through this particular one, and again, use this opportunity right now to write yours for real on a piece of paper or document wherever you'd like. But thinking about what does this look like? What does this desired future or this end state look like? Maybe if you're an individual, this is a specific career or industry or work style or work setting or work environment that you're looking for. If you're in an organizational setting, perhaps this is how your company is positioned in the market, how you are delivering work, how are you operating within your team. So again, think about what am I imagining the best case scenario to look like in the future? The next question I challenge you to think about is this ideal achievable? And I put that in here because sometimes when we talk about ideal self, it's really easy to come up with an ideal scenario which is not practical or not achievable in a reasonable time frame. And when I'm talking about reasonable time frame, again, we talked about making sure this was a sustained change for a long time. I would encourage you to focus your personal vision for probably less than 10 years, maybe even less than 5 years. Again, thinking about knowing that a lot of things are unexpected and a lot of things can change quickly. So how will you adapt your model for that? For those of you on either side, either individually or organizationally, 4 months ago, none of us thought that this is the situation we would be in, that we would have stay-at-home orders or anything like that. So thinking about how far out it is that you want to plan for and thinking that and knowing that you're going to cycle back through this process. So if you want to set yourself a shorter cycle, that's certainly possible. But thinking about whether or not it's achievable. And then the last part here is thinking about any core strengths that I or we already possess to support this vision.
And
So again, we talked about.
I'm sorry, Sarah, this is Geraldine. This is a great point too. So a number of people have responded in the chat. I just wanted to alert you because it really pertains to these which Janine had mentioned about the tension between working with strengths and weaknesses and how you personally grow from your strengths. So if you can also include that with this point.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I mean, on the individual side, thinking about some of your personal strengths, what is it that you enjoy doing? What motivates you? What are some of those things that would help you be able to move that forward? So thinking about what are you bringing to the table, either you individually or you as to your organization? What are some of the strengths that you're bringing forward and things that you're providing? So curious to know if anyone would like to include into the chat window, what is one of the questions that's maybe striking you as interesting to be including in this one? So curious to know, again, if you can put in the chat box some of the things that you're thinking related to this step. And again, I can share either publicly or privately with the group some of those things that are being shared. So. All right. So I have one or two individuals sharing that they hadn't thought about the achievable component, and then I think that's a good point here. So again, just as you're developing that ideal self or that desired future for your organization, taking a moment, maybe even reminding back to when you first learned about SMART goals that are specific, measured, actionable, realistic, and time-bound. Is this really achievable? Is what I'm setting forth really possible? So thinking about that going forward. So next, after you've developed this ideal self and the personal vision that you'd like to follow, let's think about the real self, right? And so I've got a couple of questions here again for you to consider and to think about as it is that you're working through this. So it's this real self and its comparison to the ideal self. So being honest with yourself, how does this current scenario that you're in compare to the future one? Not saying that it's not possible to be able to be done. We talked about achievable a little bit earlier, but thinking about how is this comparing? How is this going forward? And what's the difference between those two, or what are some of those gaps? We talked about the similarities that can be served as strengths. You may have identified some of those in the prior self, and maybe some of those weaknesses or gaps that need to be addressed. So as those are coming up, thinking about what are some of the things you want to change? What are some of the things you don't need to change? And you may not know all the answers to these, definitely thinking about as you are going forward, but what are some of the things that you want to consider? I have an individual chatting here that they are thinking about whether this idea is achievable. Absolutely. And when we were in the prior step, thinking about, does this make sense? Is this actually accomplishable? And then now thinking about your real self, what are some of those similarities? What are some of those things that I can bring to the table now that I may not have realized or thought of that I have can benefit from? I have an individual here asking, curious if this step blends with appreciative inquiry. Absolutely. As we blend, as we work with our organizations, working on theories of synergy and complementary skills. Yes. So if you are someone who is familiar with appreciative inquiry, or your organization uses this model, as a quick aside, so appreciative inquiry is framing conversations very similar to what we're talking about here, thinking about current state, future state, and doing more organizational planning to that model. Boyasis and also at Weatherhead talks, and appreciative inquiry came from Weatherhead as well. But it's very positively oriented, positively framed, very future focused, and thinking about what is that best self, what is something that comes forward. So absolutely, this is a very complementary tool to be used within appreciative inquiry. And if that is already language that's used in your environment, this is a great way to use this as more concrete tool Some individuals find that this tool has a little bit more structure than appreciative inquiry, and some people find that it complements really well. So great question there. Another individual shared here, thinking about ways to reach new goals. So absolutely, what are some of those opportunities? What are some of those things that you want to take forward? So, and again, I'd encourage you to think about, for these last two questions that I have here, what are some things that need to change and what are some things that don't? And maybe in your organization, this may be some things that can't change. Are there specific regulations you need to follow? Are there specific guidelines you need to adhere to, a certain grant language that you need to accommodate? So you may have some structures in place which are set. So thinking about how can you accommodate and how can you operate in that framework. I have another individual talking about procrastination is certainly a weakness for them. Thinking about that ideal self and then get sidetracked and deciding on the change tomorrow. So that's a great segue actually into thinking about our learning agenda. So how will you and or your organization move towards this ideal scenario? How will you address that? And knowing what you know about yourself, maybe that you are one to easily move to procrastination, thinking about, as we talked in that model, that center core, those relationships, and we'll get to it in number 5, but who is your support, right? Who can you talk to? Who can you tell to say, you know what, I really struggle with actually making this happen. Can we have conversations every 2 weeks to make sure that I am making progress? Maybe 2 weeks is appropriate, maybe for you it's 1 week, maybe it's every month. But making sure that action is happening and building that into your plan, right? Maybe part of what you need as you know about yourself, thinking about, okay, where's the accountability? Where's the process to make sure that I am going to do that? And those relationships that you have along the way are definitely in support of that. So as we're thinking about this plan here, again, talking about those tasks, those specific things that you need to do, what steps are you going to take, what either skills or tools or abilities do you need to develop? And when this third one, when you're thinking in an organizational setting, this may be what softwares do we need to implement, what training do we need to offer, what coaching, what mentoring, what succession planning. There may be some other competencies. I would encourage you to kind of expand and think a little bit differently about what are some of those things that we need if, let's say, we want to be a fully remote organization by choice. So if we want to be a fully remote organization, maybe we need staff managers trained a certain way, staff prepared a certain way, technology done a certain way, our shared drive done a certain way. So just thinking about what are some of those competencies or skills that you would expect of your staff going forward. Then after taking the time to identify them, thinking about how are you going to learn this? How are you going to develop that skill? Is there someone that you'd like to model yourself off of? Again, both individual and organization. Have you identified, let's say personally, someone who you want to develop? They really do presentation well. They really do leadership well. They really do communication well. Go to them and learn how can you learn more. If on the organizational side, you want to be better at, let's say, customer service, there are a lot of different companies, both national and local, that you could go to for some guidance. Perhaps you want to be better at funding or donor management or grant writing. There are other opportunities for you to be able to collaborate, again, both in our local community and nationally, on how you can learn those. How can you develop that expertise going forward? I have an individual talking about what is the accountability that's available and how do they maintain that energy going forward. You know, that it starts strong and then how does it keep going along the process. And I think that that's you knowing yourself and understanding how it is that you're going to build that into your structure. So again, we took time at the beginning to talk about our ideal self and our current self, right? Maybe currently yours is, you are someone or your organization is one that gets out of the gate running fast and then kind of peters on after that. How are you going to build into your plan that you do have regular check-ins, you do keep the energy going, that you do have champions that are bringing that forward? And if you don't have those individuals or have people that have that strength for you, how are you going to develop it? Those are questions 3 and 4 right here. So if you don't have the capacity or the skill to be able to maintain a behavior over a long period of time, how would you do that? How would you take that going forward? So thinking about that, Next, moving into experimentation, right? This is where you're practicing. This is where you're thinking about how it is that you're going to apply it. I have a question here talking about, is there a list of competencies you can share for nonprofits just starting out? Let me think about that. I don't have a list off the top of my head, but I can certainly get back to you on that and maybe even share with the whole group. So here, thinking about experimentation and practice. So as I mentioned in the organizational example, if you're rolling out a new software, a new initiative, you don't go live into production for the whole organization without having done a test first. Again, in the plan scenario where there isn't some kind of an emergency. So what is the area that you're going to do that test? What does that look like? Who are your users? Who are the people who are going to be able to do that going forward? Maybe you're the individual, right? Let's say you want to develop your skills around budgetary competence. How are you going to practice that? What are the meetings that you can sit in? Is there a place where you can experiment? Is there a draft budget that you can work on? Can you meet with a finance director? Can you meet with a accountant to talk about? What are some of the ways that you can develop that skill a little bit more, again, in an achievable fashion? So thinking about how is that going to be done for you going forward. And so first we talked about how are you going to do it, and then the second question, either with whom or where is the best place to do this. The next one is the tricky one. How will you know that you've developed it sufficiently? So I encourage you for this one, as you're thinking about your own goal, how are you going to know that you have, let's say, developed a competency in presentation, or developed a competency in financial acumen, or developed a competency in remote readiness? What are some of the metrics and what are some of the things that you are going to consider? And what measures will you use to know you've been successful? How are you ensuring that you know when it is that you got the job done? And again, this ties back, if you're familiar with the SMART goal framework, how will you know when this has been accomplished? Not taking the time up front, again, to kind of design this and think about it. You may go months or weeks or years down the process and not know, are you there yet? And so taking the time to think about how will I know and how will I adjust my plan? How will I take that going forward? So as we think about this last section, these are these relationships that I was mentioning. So they're trusting and resonant relationships that enable a person to experience and process. That means either discuss or digest or think about each of the discovery in the overall process. So it's two processes, I know. But thinking about who can be your partner in this process, who's a mentor. Let's say you're doing this for a project or an organizational setting. You may also have a mentor, but who is your sponsor? Who is your champion? Who is a stakeholder whom you can meet with to ensure that this is working going forward? Thinking about which individuals or groups can provide you guidance on this progress. Do you have a board that you report to, either a personal board or an organizational board? Do you have a mentor network? Do you have individuals who have that expertise who can comment and let you know how it is that you're doing? What ways will these individuals hold us accountable? Now, I'm not saying, and I know we talked a little bit about accountability, it is not the sole job of this partner to do all of your accountability for you, but this should be a conversation that you have with them, right? I would like to commit to meeting with you on this regular frequency, and here are the questions I'd like you to ask me, but I'm responsible for coming with the answers. And so that might be a conversation you have, again, either with a mentor, a coach, a partner, a colleague, a friend, to ensure that you're having that regular dialogue about what it is that you'd like to accomplish. And this agreement regarding expectations. Again, being really explicit in the relationships that you have to understand who's doing what and who has the ball in their court, as it were. So thinking about that going forward. And how are you going to use these relationships to your best benefit? So we've gone through the different 5 discoveries. We've drafted our entire plan. Again, I encourage you to take a longer time to do this. We're running through it quickly in this scenario. But one of the questions I get asked is, okay, I've made my plan. It's a really short time frame. I'm ready to go. And my next question is, take your time on this. There's a nice story, a parable of sorts that talks about an individual who was saying that he didn't feel rich. And let's say he had 10 points. And the wise person came to him and said, okay, if I give you one more, are you rich then? and one more, are you rich then? And the answer was always no, until the point where he had a massive pile of gold and they said, are you rich now? He said, no, but if I give you one more, will you be? And I think the key in here is thinking about how it is that we are developing, right? This is gradual. This is one coin at a time. This is one step at a time. And upon reflection and looking back and thinking about the process, you may have, moved quite a bit along the way. So it's okay if this doesn't get accomplished in one day. It certainly is not intended to take one day. Most individuals I find or that I work with in the career space, it can take them anywhere from 2 to 3 months to move into a new role. Again, being really intentional and deliberate about it. Organizational projects that get rolled out or initiatives, I've seen ones that are multi-year format. Again, sometimes things take a longer time to think about how it is that we're going to accomplish this and what's that overall vision. As we talked about, this is an iterative process. We're going to move through that cycle multiple times in the time frame that you're thinking about. And it's okay to make adjustments, right? It's okay to make adjustments. You're expected to make adjustments. Your learning agenda may change. Your strength column is going to get longer and larger as you're developing more competencies. And you're slowly going to be working on all of those gaps or opportunities for development. And the last part here is getting that feedback and support along the way. It's easier to make a plan or a project and do it in a vacuum, do it alone, and not have any of that support going forward. And so again, really taking the time to think about who is either your board you're reporting to, your supervisor you're reporting to, the leader that you're reporting to, or individually, who's on your personal board. Who are the people that are going to support you and give you feedback about how your process is going and what it is that you've learned so far. So I want to open it up now to some questions. Is there any other thoughts that people have about this process, applying it in their organizations around change, or bringing it forward to an individual change that they're looking to make? So again, into the chat, happy to answer any questions that the group may have about using intentional change theory, using this model as it relates to bringing personal change and identifying your ideal self.
Right. And Sarah, while people are responding, I just wanted to share, there was an earlier question too from Shandala about, and I think you may have some really good insight on this, is as they're going through that personal change, what are some actual assessments that they can use? I know typically one of the assessments is a 360 assessment, but I know you probably have some others that you would like to maybe recommend.
Absolutely. So on the individual side, yes, a 360-degree assessment, and there are a number out in the market and a number of individuals trained on them. A 360-degree assessment is where you, as the focal person, have people from all different aspects of your life give feedback. And so that's your supervisor, that's a peer that you work with, perhaps a direct report, people on your committee. So you are getting a representative sample of how people view you. What are your strengths? What are your competencies? What are some of your opportunities for improvement? And having the opportunity to use a tool like that is extremely effective as it relates to professional development. Typically, those are done, I've seen them done by organizations choosing to identify individuals to do that. But that being said, you as an individual can choose to do that as well. You just need to find someone who can administer a particular tool and take that forward. I use the emotional and social competence inventory, but again, there are a number of different 360 assessments out there. Organizationally, you could use a 360-degree assessment to look at a specific leader on how they would be able to administer change. Typically, I've seen organizations use something closer to an organizational climate survey to get a sense of what's working in the department, what's not, what are some opportunities, and that can be done at the unit-specific level, and that can be done at the organizational level. Other than doing 360 assessments, there are smaller assessments that you can also take. So there are a number of different tools that are available. There's a lot of different either behavioral-based or definitely you could use a personality-based assessment as well. I'd err to the side of using a more behavioral assessment, again, because it speaks to competencies and development on that angle, but there are a number in the examples. I think that as companies or as individuals are thinking about measuring growth, this is where we talked about how will you know you've accomplished this, right? And so I see from some of the questions here thinking about measurement of change or measurement of progress, how well you define that up front, either with or without an assessment. But what is the data point that you're going to look at that's going to tell you that you're improving? So if you're an organization that wants to improve the customer experience, there's a number of things you could pick. You could pick customer satisfaction, you could pick program effectiveness, you could pick a number of different tools, but what is it telling you? And so being really clear about that data selection and that data definition on how you know that you will have made a difference. For individuals, again, kind of measuring that change. How will you know you've developed, let's say, a competence in presentation skill or communication skill? Yes, there are different tools that, let's say, you could assess yourself, get a pre and a post, or get a baseline and then an effective change. Those are certainly possible in gaining feedback. Typically, for that more competency-based change, that's a conversation with someone who can provide you that expertise and that feedback. Again, it can be a peer, a coach, a mentor, to observe change over time. So typically in standard coaching relationships, those are a minimum of, let's say, 6 months, or some do 3 months, but being able to have time to observe that change. So we looked in the cycle, we talked about the practicing and experimenting. It's one thing to be exposed to that new skill, it's one thing to learn about it, hear about it, and then it's another thing to do it. So taking the time to do that implementation, do that practice of whatever it is that you or your organization is trying out, you have to be really clear on what the metric is. I'll give a really kind of basic personal example. Let's say your goal is to become healthier. Okay, well, what are some ways to measure health? And it may not just be what's on the scale. Perhaps it's how many hours are you sleeping? What is the type of food that you're ingesting? What is the exercise that you're doing? What is the how you feel in the morning, and how do you score that? So being really deliberate about the data points that you're going to use to know that you're measuring progress. And I'm just using, getting healthy as an example. You can apply it to your career, you can apply it to an organizational setting, but making sure that your metrics are really well defined will help you as you're going through the process and assessing whether or not you're being effective. Are there any other questions from the group? I'm seeing most of the ones I've seen recently are about assessment, so I hope that answers the question for those that were asking.
Right. No, thank you, Sarah. That was wonderful, and I don't see maybe just a couple thank yous popping up from people who are getting ready to sign off. Well, with that, I think everyone would like to thank you, Sarah. I know I definitely, on behalf of Corporate College, thank you for today's session. I really want to thank everyone else also for joining us today. And please don't forget to review and follow through on the intentional change theory, the 5 discoveries to make you your ideal self. And remember, Corporate College is here to serve you with essential learning to overcome the challenges you may be facing right now. We offer virtual classroom training and self-paced online programs. Our subject matter experts can provide organizational consultation services, training, and coaching. And you'll find many of our classes are also offered virtually, such as our frontline leadership certificate program, Lean Six Sigma, even patient access specialists. And you can find all of those on our website. Please feel free to rewatch and share today's presentation by visiting our Corporate College website in the next few days, and then clicking on the free webinar series link. You can also stay up to date on everything we're doing by following us on social media. So thank you again for joining us today. Stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you again. Bye-bye.